Anyone who's ever watched one of my videos knows that I love an underdog. I love the cars that have interesting engineering and a convoluted history, because it's cars like this that allow us to look at the social history of motoring. And when I hear people cry that a particular car is rubbish or something along those lines, it makes me all the more intrigued. And it's for those reasons that I love the artist formerly known as British Leyland. And what better car to study the simultaneous genius and failure of that company is there than the Austin Maxi? So today on TwinCam, we're going to look at the development and history of this criminally underrated and very forward-thinking car, then work out why the Maxi was so unloved in period, and as a result, why British Leyland found itself in such a deep hole in the early 1970s. To understand why the Maxi exists, we must first travel back to BMC in the mid-1960s. The company's existing mid-size saloon cars were the Austin Cambridge and Morris Oxford, known collectively as the Farinas thanks to their Pininfarina styling. These models were launched in 1959, but very quickly began to look outdated as competitors came along, like the Ford Cortina in 1962. But BMC knew where the future lay in car design. They had the services of their genius engineer, Alec Issigonis, who had proved with his Mini and 1100 that transverse engines and front-wheel drive were the answer. But to complete the set, BMC needed an all-new mid-size saloon car. The car they developed and launched was the Austin & Morris 1800, or the Landcrab as it became known. But thanks to an awful lot of product drift, it was really too large to compete directly with the Cortina. And in terms of desirability, the Landcrab's awkward styling and stance, hence the nickname, and Issigonis' taste for minimalism meant that this car was a failure. As a result, the Farinas remained in production and BMC commissioned a new car that would complement the Landcrab but compete more directly with the Cortina, featuring a smaller body, smaller engines and a much needed dose of desirability. Work began on this car less than a year after the Landcrab was launched in mid-1965, an indication of just how quickly BMC noticed a problem. The baseline for the new car was to sit on a wheelbase of 100 inches, roughly halfway between the 1100 and 1800 and 2 inches longer than the Mark II Cortina. But this, almost immediately, is where it all began to go wrong. A few sentences ago I mentioned the product drift encountered by the Landcrab, but almost from the outset the Maxi was constrained by the existing car. In an effort to stem the hemorrhaging of money from BMC, managing director George Harriman insisted that the new car use the doors from the old car. This immediately scuppered any opportunity for the Maxi to pull away from the awkwardness of the Landcrab, and it also meant that the wheelbase had to be extended by about 6 inches and the rake of the windscreen was already set before anybody had even thought about the styling. So when the Maxi was launched in 1969, it already looked about 5 years old. And these doors are responsible for people even today confusing the Landcrab and the Maxi, over 50 years since its launch. But the positive coming from this is that BMC did save a little bit of money. After all, that's what they really needed to do at this point. But then they decided that the Maxi deserved an all-new engine. This engine is known as the E-Series, and it wasn't purely designed for the Maxi, but to replace the elderly B-Series that featured in cars including the Landcrab and MGB. On paper, this new unit brought BMC's engines up to date with an overhead camshaft and an all-new factory in which to produce it. But, as we've come to expect now, things were about to get a lot more complicated. Issigonis dictated that instead of simply having a range of different engine sizes, the larger E-Series should instead be a straight 6. In order to fit that in with the transverse engine front-wheel drive mantra that BMC was pursuing, the engine had to be incredibly compact. And with those two conditions in place, the E-Series began to emerge as a 1.5 litre four-cylinder and a 2.2 litre straight six. The Maxi was only planned to receive the 4-pot variant of the E-Series, but years before its launch, the engineers began to notice that the 1500 unit wasn't quite up to the task of being a range topper, or indeed being the only engine available in the Maxi. This all reeks of a company in a truly dire strait, not even being able to conjure up a coherent new model or engine range, never mind return itself to health. But the engineers dealt with the limitations, adjusting the stroke to increase the displacement to 1750cc, as we have here in this top-of-the-range Maxi HL. That spec also includes twin HS6 SU carburetors, bringing the power output up to 91 brake horsepower and torque to 104 pound-feet, just shy of the 2-litre Cortina. Though the Maxi wouldn't receive the straight 6 E-Series, the common tooling did have an impact on the 4-pot. In order to fit the engine transversely in other products, it prioritised a long stroke, making the engine taller, necessitating the continuation of the famous BMC gearbox in sump layout. Though by this point Fiat had shown that the way forwards was mounting the gearbox on the end of the crankshaft, BMC stuck with their existing layout, and as they designed a new engine, a new gearbox followed suit. But despite the engineering peculiarities, this was the first factor that would put the Maxi well ahead of the competition. The big advance with the Maxi was the inclusion of a 5-speed gearbox. Now for 1969, this wasn't just a nice feature, but it was a first for a mainstream family car. And not only that, but the 5-speed box came as standard fitment. The early 1970s saw a fair few family cars launch with a 5th ratio, but it took until the 1990s for almost every car to come with 5 speeds as standard. In fact, the Maxi was so ahead of its time in this regard that a number of commentators questioned the need for a 5th gear. They complained that 5 gears was too many, or that people would just only use the 4. I do wonder what they think of modern automatic gearboxes with 10 speeds, but there you go. But there was a far bigger issue for the Maxi's gearbox to contend with. Rather than use a long pudding stirrer gear lever that went straight into the back of the gearbox or rods to provide a remote change, the Maxi would instead use cables to command the gears. A cable change gearbox is now the standard for a manual transmission. For decades, manufacturers have used this technique to be able to place the gear lever and the selector mechanism on the box itself for wherever they wish, but when the Maxi was launched, this was still novel. While the existing rod change gears in sump layout was never the final word in refinement or gear change quality, it was acceptable for its day. But combine that with an underdeveloped cable change system and it was a disaster. BMC knew before its launch that the change quality was unacceptable, but once it was launched, the press confirmed their fears. The Maxi's gear change was appalling, and so, despite the advances, barely anybody cared. The annoying part of this story, which is beginning to become a theme with Austin Morris BL products, is that they knew the issues existed. In fact, the Maxi was rushed out, being launched in April 1969, following a few years of internal disagreements, stunted development, and questionable engineering solutions. And as such, nobody at BL was happy with the car as it was launched. In fact, a rather major facelift appeared only 18 months later in October 1970. As a part of that upgrade, the Maxi received a new grille, a new dashboard, and most importantly, a rod change mechanism. The cable change system was just underdeveloped, and in the intervening months, BL decided that the best course of action was to take the easy route out and cut their losses when it came to the car's reputation. The palaver with the Maxi's gearbox severely affected that reputation, and while the rod change would never set the world alight, it is absolutely not the utter disaster that armchair commentators would have you believe. But that is proof of the importance of good press and a positive public perception. Once word was out there, no matter the alterations, the Maxi's reputation for an awful gear change was set in stone. But what the facelift couldn't cure was the styling. The existing Landcrab had very short overhangs, and with the Maxi sharing its doors, BMC had no choice in how the Maxi's side profile appeared. The angle of the windscreen and roofline, as well as the positioning of the rear wheels, were all set before anybody had started thinking. In fact, the styling of the Maxi descended into a full-blown crisis, and in the perilous financial position in which they found themselves, they couldn't afford another ugly duckling. The car was facelifted a number of times before it ever hit the road, gaining enough attention to attract an article in the Times. But BMC had gained the services of Roy Haynes, former design director at Ford, and he was charged with making the Maxi as presentable as possible. It's for this reason that it shares such a glaring frontal similarity with the Mark II Cortina, and it also shares this look with the facelifted Mini Clubman to go alongside each other as the Mini and the Maxi. For 1969, this is a sharp modern appearance, but as we look beyond the front end, it begins to tread on uneven ground. Take the Landcrab Source doors. They're fine. They are a little too long for a car of this size, hence the wheelbase extension and the Maxi appearing slightly stretched, but nobody is at all offended by them. The issue the stylists faced, though, was not in how to integrate the Landcrab's doors into a smaller car, but how to integrate the Maxi's signature design advantage, the appearance of a hatchback. The Maxi was by no means the first in this regard, as the Renault 16, for example, had been about for a few years, but this was something that no car maker in Britain had even considered in a car of this type. The task was to give the Maxi the practicality feature that would put it ahead of any other mainstream family car in Britain without making it look as though it was an estate car. As a result, the angle of the tailgate was decided by the placement of the rear wheels and the rear doors, nothing at all to do with a stylistic decision. Therefore, the Maxi's style exists purely thanks to practicality and a make-do-and-mend attitude. This is reflected in the sheer size of the tailgate, which we'll get to later, and the rear lamps. They're triangular shaped and designed to interfere as little as possible with the Maxi's load-carrying capabilities. Additionally, those doors debuted in 1964, 5 years before the Maxi's launch, making it appear dated from day one. And that issue was compounded by the beauty of the Mark II Ford Cortina, then the shift towards the curvy Coke bottle styling of the Mark III. This contrast made the Maxi deeply uncool. It just looked old. Combine old with awkward and we're well along the path to a car that is ridiculed. But does this mean the Maxi is ugly? I don't think it is. It's certainly awkward, but looking at it from a classic perspective, it's such a mishmash of styles that it draws my attention in. Once you understand why the decisions were made, it begins to make more and more sense as an example of utilitarian design, like the Renault 4 for example, necessitated in this case by a company that was falling to its knees. The individual marques that made up BMC, formed in 1952, joined into the even bigger party of British Leyland in 1968, and with this company beginning to sink, management did finally notice that a change of direction was necessary. The Maxi was the beginning of a sea change at BL, as the existing Mini 1100 and Landcrab were all badge engineered to death. The buyouts and mergers that led to BMC meant that those three cars could be badged either as Austins, Morrises, Wolseleys, Rileys, MGs or Vanden Plasses. And this didn't just confuse the consumer, but it caused friction within the company. Those who worked at the factories belonging originally to either Austin or Morris felt allegiance to those individual brands. And even the dealers were split down those lines. This is what led to the idea that BL hated itself, and in part, that was true. When it came to launching the Maxi, a decision was made that this car would only ever be an Austin. BL's two volume marques, Austin and Morris, would be retained, but each selling very different products. Austins would be technologically adventurous and avant-garde like this Maxi here, and Morris's would be completely the opposite. They would be well-proven basic transport to compete with the likes of Ford. Though the only three cars ever developed in this mindset were the Maxi here, the Morris Marina and the Austin Allegro. While this would eventually fall apart as BL neared collapse in 1975, it paved the way for the rationalisation that temporarily saved the company through to the 1980s. But before that could happen, one more quirk of the Leyland era would hit the way the Maxi was marketed. Following BL's effective nationalisation, a few cars became purely Leyland products, therefore being allowed to be sold by both Austin and Morris dealers, helping that rationalisation along in the short term, even if this was to the detriment of brand recognition. The Mini, Princess and Maxi had lost their identities, being branded purely with the Leyland plug-hole, hence the lack of Austin badges on this 1979 example. Additionally, despite the Maxi being considered an Austin, it was actually built at Cowley, the home of Morris, bringing with it another tiny step in integration and rationalisation. The Maxi's marketing and public image were messy at best, and so the way we see the Maxi's genius is both through the mechanical layout and its sheer brilliance when it comes to just being transport. So how practical does the fifth door actually make the Maxi? At the end of the day, everything's available with a hatchback now, so what makes this thing special? Well, first of all, the door is enormous. It is absolutely as large as they could possibly make it, meaning that there's nothing that can't fit through this gap that might fit in the boot. Also, there is no load lip, so this is already among the most practical cars. Taking away the parcel shelf, how BMC engineered this much space into the back of a car that is smaller than a current Fiesta, and yes, it genuinely is, I have no idea. The leap between the saloon cars of the day, in which you had to place stuff down into the boot and not very big things, and then the Maxi, is enormous. And is there any wonder that BL extensively used the Maxi's practicality in its advertising? Compared to any other car, including fellow hatchback the Renault 16, the Maxi is miles ahead. It was at the very genesis of people in Britain switching towards hatchbacks as other manufacturers slowly caught up through the following decade and a half. In fact, it would take the former Roots Group until 1975, then Vauxhall and Ford until 1981 and 82 respectively, to follow the Maxi's lead in offering a mid-size family car as a fully fledged hatchback. But we can't look at the boot without showing off the Maxi's party piece, as this interior was designed to be versatile, and so the rear seats fold to a completely flat load bay, and then all the seats recline into a bed. How many people made use of this, I do not know, but it's a bed. Considering then that it is smaller than a new Fiesta, you might imagine that the rear seat occupants are hard done by, especially considering how much room is dedicated to luggage. But you'd be wrong. Thanks to the land crab doors and that lengthened wheelbase, the Maxi is enormous inside. I mean, look at the amount of legroom I have here in a car that theoretically is so small, but back in the 70s it was actually quite a big car. These seats are lovely and squishy, so I'd be perfectly comfortable here on a journey of any length really, and I suppose that you could actually fit 3 people in the back of a Maxi on a long journey and it actually be comfortable. Despite the black upholstery though, it is really airy and light in here, partially thanks to the glass house and the fact that the pillars are so tiny, so the visibility is fantastic. and it is just bright. The light is everywhere, and sitting here, there is such a huge view out. The B-pillar is so far forwards compared to where I'm sat here. It seems almost panoramic, really. And thanks to those doors, the windows actually roll all the way down, and you even get a little ashtray down at the bottom of the door on both sides. In the front, it's much the same story, but unlike the Mini 1100 and Land Crab, the Maxi feels so much more grown up. As I mentioned earlier, one of the major Land Crab criticisms was how minimalist the interior was, and that therefore meant that consumers felt like they were driving a cheaper car. This undoubtedly upset Issigonis, but the Maxi was given a proper dashboard. Now, this was another thing that was updated in the 1970 facelift, but it was actually made simpler, and I think it's indicative of the Land Crab's dashboard, how this can be described as luxurious in comparison. 2 instrument pods in front of the driver displaying speed, fuel level and coolant temperature. Then there's a smattering of switches for the lights, wipers, hazards, etc. Then in the centre, a cutout for the heater controls and a radio, and a small glove box over on the passenger side. On each end of the dash are 2 small vents, and behind the steering wheel a single stalk for the indicators and main beam. But that steering wheel is a seriously cool bit of design. This car, being in 1979, wouldn't have had this wheel originally, as this is from an earlier Maxi HL. But how could you resist? But alongside those things mentioned on the dashboard are an ashtray just underneath it, and of course you get a cigarette lighter as well, and an auxiliary row of switches to the right of the steering wheel. Below the main dashboard is a big old parcel shelf in true BMC BL fashion. It's just so practicality based, this car, as were all BMC BL things, and that is a bit of a BMC BL trademark. What's also a BMC BL trademark is the driving position, because the steering wheel juts out at a slightly dodgy angle, so you almost feel like you're a bus driver. The steering wheel seems quite flat rather than in front of you. But truth be told, it's not bad at all. It's actually a little bit better than a number of other BMC BL offerings, but sitting here, the Maxi just feels right. The steering wheel is in the right place, the pedals are in the right place, and the seats are so comfortable. From a practical perspective, the Maxi was brilliant. A car that was incredibly well packaged and engineered to impress. Transverse engines, front-wheel drive and hydrolastic suspension may not have been new for BL, but compared to the rest of the market, it was still comfortably ahead. It rode and handled brilliantly, would take any people and luggage a family could throw at it, but this is all proof that perception is more important than engineering. The Austin Maxi was never the car that it really should have been, but there is absolutely no doubt that it is a work of pure genius. Had it been designed and produced by a company with stable foundations, it would have been nothing but a world beater. But unfortunately, it had British Leyland behind it, and so it stumbled its way through development and life, having never found its potential. This is one of the great might-have-beens, had it not been stunted by both its parent company and the arrogance of Alec Issigonis. As I said a few weeks ago with the Mini, Issigonis was a genius. There's no other word for him. But no genius gets away with it forever. And as time moved along, Issigonis' ideas were plagued by both BL and a world that was moving on. The Maxi would be his last car. Despite his knighthood in 1969, he was pushed out of BL to become a consultant, working on ingenious economy cars and straight-six engines for the remainder of his life. Despite the relative failure of the Land Crab and Maxi, Issigonis produced some of Britain's best-selling cars of all time. The Morris Minor brought Britain out of wartime. The Mini became the most influential car of all time, and the Austin Morris 1100 followed that theme, being the best-selling car in Britain for the best part of a decade. At the Maxi's launch, head of the new BL, Donald Stokes, proclaimed that we believe it will create the same kind of revolution in the field of middle-class family motorcars as did the Mini in the realm of small cars. And despite the underwhelm at this car's launch, he was actually right. Almost every car now has a 5-door hatchback body, a transverse engine, front-wheel drive, and at least a 5-speed cable-operated gearbox. The Austin Maxi, therefore, was never the finest car. It suffered the typical BL faults of niggling design issues, poor build quality, and a truly horrendous public image. But in the hindsight of 2021, it was the trendsetter for what the family car became. And so what better way to study that company, the genius and failure of that company, and the eccentricity of Alec Issigonis than the Maxi. And on that note, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, then please do click like and subscribe to TwinCam as well. I'm forever indebted to my wonderful Patreon supporters, so if you'd like to support me that way, then please follow the links in the description. And I'll have more videos coming along soon.